Tēnā rawa, tūkoe. Thank you. And finishing off with a challenge is always good. I've made a few notes. Frank and Diane have both asked that questions for them should be combined with our panel discussion. So it's now my pleasure to introduce the third part of this morning's session, which is where 4 experienced members of the landscape profession will each make a short presentation on some aspect of our history. I will ask each of them to briefly introduce themselves and share their thoughts, and then we will join with Frank and Diane to respond to questions together from the audience. So, Sarah Collins, invite you please. Oh, sorry, Julia. So much for run sheets.
We can't mix up our slides. Tēnā koutou katoa. Ko ingari te whakapaparanga mai. I ahau I kōtoro ana, ka nui ngā wahi, e noho ai o mi taku whanau. Engari, ko te rohi a te whanganui a tāra, tōku tūranga waiwai tuturu. O nai kei waikanai, e oho e o noho ana. Ko Julia Williams taku ingoa. Tēnā tātou katoa. I have been involved in the Institute in a number of capacities and worn a number of hats, and my recollections are going to slightly ramble and revolve around those roles. In the early days in Wellington, all graduates were involved in some form of a local landscape group. It was largely social, you probably have a good idea what that means, and we informally collaborated on jobs and shared resources. Everything about the Institute was undertaken on a voluntary basis, and we knew everyone on the landscape scene. I was lucky because my partner was a landscape architect, so I kept up to date on what was happening across the rohi, even when I was at home with a young family, and all I could do was proofread articles for the landscape, or clear the Institute post office box, shown there on the slide, or host an exec member overnight. The growth of the Institute accelerated about the year 2000, when Lincoln's undergraduate degree was well underway and Unitec landscape graduates were just emerging. At that point, the total number of members took off, and it became apparent that NZILA needed an organisation with a more transparent procedures system and with paid administrative help. We gained a more professional structure, but perhaps lost some of the earlier collegiality. We knew everyone and saw them as colleagues rather than competitors. No, I'm going to. Education and accreditation. For over 25 years, Lincoln was the only landscape program in New Zealand. Although there was constant interaction with the profession in terms of the Lincoln program providing a curriculum that reflected NZILA membership requirements, there was no formal accreditation process. In 1999, when the first cohort of students in the Unitec landscape program were due to graduate, NZILA was asked to accredit the program. There was a sense of surprise, shock, panic, sort of cumulative effects really, when we realised the need for a formal accreditation procedure and an education policy. Myself, Rachel de Lambert, Mary Buckland and Glenn Thomas from Australia formed the accreditation panel, and in rapid succession we undertook preliminary visits, established procedures for accreditation visits, based largely on cannibalising the Australian policies, and set out draft competencies for a landscape program. And just in time, because in 2000, NZILA was asked to comment on Victoria's proposed program. Malene Absalom, holding the education portfolio, in consultation with the panel and a cast of hundreds, produced the first set of accreditation and education policies in 2004. IFLA provides the standard for what's required for a landscape degree. But it's a complicated issue when there's an array of providers and qualification options, so it's not quite a well-oiled machine. Changes in education policy and programs can create new issues and need time to mature into functioning systems. And then there are changes in our culture and professional environment, as I found out in recent accreditation visits. Over the period of COVID lockdown, staff wrought miracles, turning face-to-face teaching into virtual delivery. For example, educational providers used interactive electronic studios with online forum and a continually connected network of students and staff. While the mix of virtual and real interaction reflects what the profession, and indeed the wider workforce, is moving towards, it's still a culture shock for someone of my generation. I realise how easy it is to lose currency and acknowledge that I am indeed a technological dinosaur. I think Shannon might have a slide of me later. I spent some time on the associateship panel. Remember that? Applicants had to put together a portfolio of their work, limited to no more than 2 A3 folders, although there were many permutations on what actually constituted an A3 folder. With very few exceptions, most graduates waited until a few months before the application to even read a copy of the criteria required for getting associateship. But it took an immense amount of time to put a portfolio together, with the difficulties of backtracking to assemble information, particularly for those who had worked overseas. Then it was up to the associateship panel to review the portfolios. Once a year, usually at the busy September-October time of the year, a huge parcel would arrive containing the work of 4 to 8 candidates. The presentation was extraordinary. The quality of the portfolios increased each year, especially as graduates thinking of going for associateship would attend a workshop with the previous year's successful candidates and decide to go one better. For those with spare time, e.g. no young children, redrew all their work, and there was a running joke that one year we might open the package to find a graphic simulation of the Taranaki methanol plant painted in oils, or a rendering of Darfield Reserve in watercolours. The process finished with an interview. Again in the 1970s and 80s, most candidates personally were known to someone on the accreditation panel, or the panel had its antennae out and knew something about the candidate. It was assumed that while a graduate might not be a finished product, they had the capacity to improve with experience and would do right by the profession. In the early 2000s, the Institute added an annual registration process for associate members who undertook CPD. There was enough resistance for the Institute to undertake a practice survey, which identified a wider range of issues. I responded to a registration of interest letter and got the job to conduct a review of associateship and membership categories. I consulted with everyone, from 5-year graduate plus members, secret, recent successful and unsuccessful associateship applicants, employers, comparable professional bodies in New Zealand, and British, Australian and American landscape institutes. I basically emailed everyone, visited every branch and spoke to many people. I was told by the engineers that students and graduates are the future and there where energy and resources should be focused, and I heard that. And I grew to realise that any system needed to be mindful at all stages of provisions for landscape architects who work alone, who work part-time, who live in rural areas, who for personal reasons find it hard to access a range of work or find relevant professional development opportunities. Registration, the new system, can now be seen as a progression rather than a pass, did not pass, and it's the profession's job to focus on areas of concern and provide mentoring to fill the gaps. I'm running out of time, bear with me. Our profession has always included people with strong opinions. I can recall AGMs where an afternoon might pass while argument raged over whether a new paragraph or a semicolon would be used in a piece of text. I kid you not. And principled and communal decision making is not always easy. There's always a reaction to each step the Institute makes to be more professional, and perhaps a small loss in terms of the ability to make exceptions or to react to situations on a more personal basis. It also takes time and commitment to maintain currency and relevance. NZILA is a strong presence when one is on a committee or a panel. I'm afraid it fades to a dull hum, sometimes even an annoying whine, when in everyday life when work and family fill your time. So as part of my reflection and talk of early days, I'd like to throw a pitch, not to forget our past, and to embrace the wider concept of professional growth and collegiality, where there's an opportunity for all members to share the workload, share their professional experience, and in turn receive information on design and technology. Thank you.
Tēnā rātou koe, Tuia, thank you, and thank you particularly for the timing. Brilliant. Sarah.
Tēnā koutou katoa, e te whānau, e hui hui mai nei. Tēnā koutou katoa. E whānau mai o kei te waipounamu, engari ki tamaki makaurau. Ko Sarah Collins aho, ko Boffa Miskell e mahi ana, ko kai hoa hoa taio, toku mahi, tēnā koutou katoa. My part of this presentation is to talk about the change in the practice of landscape architecture initially, and then proceeding to some other things. I'll take you on a bit of a personal journey, which began in the learning environment at Lincoln, where my year group was a small team who got to know one another and our lecturers well. We as students were part of the fledgling institute and very interested and involved in it. When we graduated at the end of 1977, there were in the order of 50 practicing landscape architects in New Zealand. And actually, most people had no idea what a landscape architect really did. George Malcolm, who led the Ministry of Works Environmental Design section, was a founding member of the NZILA and was pivotal in the establishment of our profession. He advocated for the involvement of young landscape architects in a range of significant projects, including roading, airports, and hydro schemes. Many of us, including myself, went to jobs as landscape architects in the Ministry of Works, as well as Lands and Survey and Housing Corporation, where we began to establish ourselves and to assist the wider professional groups to gain understanding of what we could do simply by getting on with it and asserting ourselves. I worked overseas for a couple of years, returning to Auckland with valuable experience, initially setting up my own practice, and then in 1986 I joined Boffa Miskell. I was employed to set up the Auckland office. From one person, we rapidly grew to 5. It has continued to grow, nearly 250 at our recent celebrations in Queenstown. Over that period, the nature of our business has changed, but it remains a great place to work. In the early years of practice as landscape architects, we understood our responsibility to care for people and place. But much of our work was bedded in the landscaping realm. Often we were engaged late in the design process and found ourselves dealing with problems arising from our not having been involved early in the design process. The transformation to the way we work today is immense. We do our best work when we are involved from the outset, designing with the place, asserting our view amongst the views of the wider consultant team, and the outcome is a project that works with the place. so that within a short space of time it is hard to discern what the change is and the sense of the place is enriched. There was a time when only specialists doing visual simulation work had a computer on their desk, and it was during the 1990s that we all got what is by today's standards a huge computer on our desks. Today we all have 2 screens to assist in the management of documents. We collaborate using software. Young landscape architects produce beautiful drawings using a range of packages. Gone are the days of producing drawings by hand and using sketching techniques and sorry, I've lost my thread. Sketching remains the best way to develop. So I just need to go backwards. Sorry, it's gone. Yeah. So sketching remains the best way to develop thinking, using pencil and discarding and refining ideas to reach the best fit solution. If needed, one can hand sketch using collaborative software. These are very early drawings from when we were students using the typewriter techniques. Within landscape architecture, the array of specialist areas has developed to include landscape planning, urban design and landscape design. We respond to comprehensive RFPs which seek engagement, consultation and working with a range of community groups and working in collaboration with iwi. We prepare landscape assessments, work on master plans, develop concepts and work through preliminary, developed and detailed design and then the implementation phases. It is exciting work as a landscape architect. We have achieved much, however, there is much more that we are well placed to achieve. Stepping back in time, there are now 2 important aspects that I'm charged with looking at. I was on the NZILA exec from 1987 to 1991, and during that time we recognised the importance of celebrating our work and set about establishing the awards program. We secured sponsorship for the initial awards through Monia, who were the sponsor for 2 or 3 of the biennial awards. We have been supported over the years not only by Monia, but notably by Firth, Resine and many others. The support of our sponsors, as has been mentioned by others already, is not to be underestimated. It has been and continues to be an important part of the awards, bringing our work to the attention of the wider community and celebrating what we have achieved. And we have achieved much. If we take time to look back through the award winners, even just looking within one category, over the years, projects achieved in the public realm have increased in the past 2 decades and include Waitangi Park in Wellington, St Patrick's Square, Auckland, London Quay, Picton, North Wharf, Auckland, the Westhaven Promenade, Auckland, Marine Parade in Napier, Te Papa Otakaro, the Avon River Precinct in Christchurch. Noting these names feels totally inadequate, because each is a significant project which contributes to the fabric of people's everyday lives. The other aspect is the landscape. The first issues of the landscape were typeset. Small pieces of paper were cut out and glued to a backing sheet by Charlie Challenger and his support team of Jan Woodhouse and Mary Chapman. I have a vivid memory of this happening when we were students. The landscape continued and evolved from that time, moving to Wellington in 1982, where it was produced by an editorial committee of Frank Boffa, Boyden Evans and Julia Williams. 54 issues were produced, and those magazines, each of which I still have, reflect the growth and development of the Institute. It was a sad day when the publications were unable to continue and the final issue was published, with Charlie Challenger writing the final editorial in 1984. How we might continue the magazine was an important issue over that period, and I was on exec. It was a significant vehicle to showcase our work, and we were exploring options. From the last issue of The Landscape in 1994, the importance of establishing a magazine became more of an issue. Di was the NZILA president, and AGM published Architecture New Zealand, was identified for their publishing expertise and experience and foresight. Jan and I lived in Auckland, and over an extended period in the early 1990s, we spent many hours meeting with Barbara Glennie, Robin Beckett and Kirsty Robinson at AGM, discussing our work and pursuing them to take the publication on. The first issue of Landscape New Zealand was published in January 1996. It was a joint publication between Leanne's, the Landscape Industries Association, and the NZILA. The link between concept design and well-executed construction was recognised. An editorial panel of landscape architects met at AGM, working with the AGM editorial committee and publishing team. Landscape Architecture New Zealand was launched late in 2009 with Shona Lindsay as the editor. There was continued to be an editorial panel. It later changed its format and Michael Barrett was the editor. At the beginning of 2016, AGM advised that the NZILA was AGM advised the NZILA that it was no longer viable to produce the magazine. Some digital magazines were produced by the NZILA, and in 2017, Landscape Architecture Aotearoa was born, and it continues to be the communication vehicle today, complemented by social media. These are but brief reflections and are guided by the things that have touched me personally, but all have been important in our growth and development. In conclusion, today, the relationship between human health and nature is even more critically important. As we as a profession have grown over recent years, we have taken the steps to become more culturally grounded in our practice. We can and do work collegially and collaboratively, and we are a profession that could be well equipped to lead the world where human health and environment could coexist. There is much for us to do within Tuia, Pito, or the New Zealand Institute of Landscape Architects, and within our professional working lives to ensure that we collaborate well together, embrace Matauranga Māori, and care for our landscape, the landscape that we love. The work can become all-consuming, and it certainly takes time and energy. It is important that we continue to work collegially, mentor our younger members, and expend energy delivering only our best work. Kia pai tō rā.
Tēnā raka, okay. Sarah, I'm just going to go off script here for a couple of minutes. As we're working our way through here, I've just got a note down from our health and safety advisors, and I'd like you to start practicing what we're going to do for the discussion. Now, in the discussion, in order to ask a question, I'm going to ask you to raise your hand. And so we're just going to practice raising our hands for a minute, please. That's it. Oh. All good? So just remember that, because we're going to be needing that later on. Stephen Brown, please, your presentation.
Kia ora tātou. I'm not going to provide an introduction to myself. The subject is quite dry and boring, so let's get underway as quickly as possible. Look, I was fascinated by some of Sarah's comments before about photocopying images, because I remember back in 1991 taking elevations of Sky Tower scaling them to different sizes, colouring them with Pantone markers, and gluing them on photos that then went to the Environment Court. Times have changed. The launch of Te Tangiati Manu this year was a milestone for the Institute. It's an evolution of landscape assessment and planning theory in this country. It's a rational and modern platform for undertaking assessment that helps to guide all from young graduate landscape architects to key decision makers. So there has been a long lead up to this. And I'm just going to cover the last 50 years in 3 very quick steps, because I think there have been 3 periods of evolution in terms of landscape planning and assessment as distinct from landscape architecture as a profession which is much more broadly based. The first era, which roughly covers the 1960s to 80s, I'm going to refer to as the McHarg era. And of course, the foundation for that is found in Design with Nature from Ian McHarg, which was published in 1969. And who can ever forget the sieve mapping, the overlays and so on, that then became the foundation for a whole series of publications and landscape assessment theory from that period onwards. So that was covered then in publications like our National Landscape, which covered a lot of the major thinking going on in Europe and the United States up to 1979. Landscape and Land Use Planning by Derek Lovejoy. Similar work by Julius Fabos. And it actually culminated in a publication called Integrating Conservation and Development, a proposal for a New Zealand conservation strategy put out by the Nature Conservation Council in 1981. So we were following and train overseas thought by and large during this period. And I guess some of the ways of thinking about this period are that it was dominated by a focus on visual and biophysical management, new ways of seeing countryside and cities, use of overlays and sieve mapping, increasing use of photography to help explain landscapes and to help interpret landscapes as well. Use of sketches and simulations and overlays and scales models on photos to depict what new development would look like in project-based assessments. And I've still got at home some very early sketches that I did of a bridge or bridge options over the Medway River in the UK at that time. Public preference testing, largely coming out of the work from Penning Rousel in the UK, which was fundamental to the first regional landscape assessment undertaken in this country from 1982 to 84 in the Auckland region, and involved over 1,100 participants by the members of the public throughout the region. So that was the first period. The second one I'm going to refer to is the one that relates to the Kaplans and Q sort. And this was really the 1990s through to the early 2020s. Internationally at that stage, and this goes through to the second now National Landscape Conference held in Switzerland in 2006. A lot of thinking internationally was still focused very much on visual interpretation of the landscape and the work of Stephen and Rachel Kaplan. So we had ideas, the idea of the 2D picture plane and 3D spatial array, vividness, complexity, cohesion, legibility, mystery, and so on. Ways of interpreting landscape that had a sort of social interpretive approach. But in New Zealand, we were starting to break away from those ideas. And there was a major transition to homegrown strategic assessment approaches for regional and district assessments. There had already been quite a lot of work undertaken on what I've referred to as reductionist assessment, both R sort and Q sort, VAMPLAN, the second Auckland Regional Landscape Assessment, which was completed after workshops with landscape planners in both Auckland and Christchurch. There were the Q sort studies, which provided quite a a really interesting and substantial foundation for a lot of that work at the time. And Simon was central to that, along with John Fairweather. And at the same time, work was being undertaken by people like Lars Braben and Greg Brown in Otago and South Westland. Those studies actually were quite broad-based. They covered everywhere from Auckland and Westland, the Coromandel, Rotorua, Kaikoura, and so on. So they actually provide quite an important foundation. And just 3 weeks ago, I was actually asked about those studies in an Environment Court hearing over a coal mine that was being held in Christchurch. And I was specifically questioned about the relevance of the Q-sort studies and what sort of interpretive foundation they provided in terms of landscapes now. At the same time, in 1991, we had the emergence of the RMA and the effective split of landscape into outstanding natural landscapes, amenity landscapes, and natural character. So you not only have the acknowledgement at a statutory level of the importance of landscape, you also have this splitting apart of it as different component members. We also had, after that, the emergence of the modified Pigeon Bay and Wesi decisions, which were quite fundamental in terms of changing the way in which landscapes were seen. It was no longer just a visual umbrella. It was one that started to embrace cultural values, tangata whenua values, historic heritage values, a stronger overlap with biophysical assessment. And there was a strong sense that New Zealand had moved away from our national landscape type paradigms and was in many ways at the cutting edge of landscape interpretation for the world. Running in sync with that, or in parallel with it, was the convergence of urban landscape design and urban design, combining with the RMA to push project assessment into becoming much more specialised. So there were divisions between landscape, amenity, and natural character assessment, knowing what questions to ask in relation to each. There was a stronger statutory framework for assessment. There was greater appreciation of landscape context, and that certainly comes through in the NZCPS 2010. Viewpoint analyses had been used for quite some time before this, but there was an increasing focus upon how to use the interpretation from viewpoint analyses. There were computerised simulations and more technological input in general. And of course, there was the NZILA's own best practice guides, 10.1 and 10.2. At that stage, dealing with landscape assessment and with photo simulations. All of these were showing an increasing maturation of landscape assessment, both at a strategic level and project focused for the Institute and by practitioners. So the last period I'm going to deal with is the one that I call the post-Pigeon Bay era, and really from 2010 onwards. Strategic assessment now has become much more strongly focused on community tangata whenua, mana whenua engagement. The rise of associative values, as I've called it, sociological interpretation of landscape and its meanings. There's also much more explicit identification of landscape attributes, characteristics and values. This has become much more fundamental, and it's certainly enshrined in Te Tangi Ati Manu. An increasing focus on climate change and its effects, and on climate change resilience. And the establishment of landscape bottom lines, which appears to be the direction the new the post-RMA legislation is heading, though I think it's got some frailties in other areas. So where are the challenges for us now? Complexity of New Zealand landscape and who owns it, who are mana whenua and how to meaningfully engage with them at both the strategic and project levels, how to engage with the whenua at large and stakeholders, and how do we meaningfully interpret their values. There's also the issue of actually dealing with Te Tangi Ati Manu's the guidelines and new landscape imagery modelling guidelines. Just where and when are they to be applied? When is it appropriate? We have to be selective about this. They're just not a blueprint for every assessment in every location. We've also got issues related to management of large parts of Aotearoa that are not O&Ls and have become, in many cases, a sort of rural industrial zone largely devoid of character, element, patterns and values. In other words, the sheep and cattle wrecked country that was described in The Guardian in 2017. The need to rewild much of New Zealand. And lastly, the threat posed by poor quality environmental legislation, which is one we're faced with at present. So I think there's a big overall sort of challenge for landscape architects. The first is that I'm going to pose two questions. The first is, have we simply come to the realisation that landscape is another term for environment? And in assuming the role of being all things to all situations, have landscape architects lost their focus and identity to some degree? And the second is, and in producing Te Tangi Ate Manu, have we provided a blueprint for effective landscape assessment and management that placates the demands of decision makers, including the Environment Court, but also created a theoretical straitjacket that, in conjunction with associated expectations, is quite simply beyond the expertise of most landscape architects to fulfil and meet? So look, on those two notes I'm going to conclude. I would just like to say that there are two people who I wish to especially thank for the evolution of landscape planning and assessment in this country. The first was effectively a mentor for me in the early stages of my career, Alan Rackham, and during the middle stages, Simon. I can't thank Simon Swaffield enough for his contribution to the landscape assessment and landscape planning in this country. He has been key to the evolution of that practice.
Thank you twice over, Stephen. It's striking me very much the range of practice challenges that you've outlined and the range of practice that Sarah has outlined is explaining some of the challenges that Julia and her colleagues on the accreditation and registration panels face all the time, and that ain't going to get any easier. So just to continue the story, Shannon Bray, please.
Morena, Stephen, I was worried when you said that the profession I've chosen is going to be dry. Thankfully, it wasn't. Kia ora, thank you for inviting me to Auckland. It's always lovely to visit. I must say it's always very nice going home again to Hawke's Bay. And I also realised that 50 years of the Institute, I think there was a guy warbling on the radio saying he was a linesman from our country. But thankfully Stephen Tyler is telling him to dream on. I'm the youngest person on the stage here. I was born at the same time as the Institute. When Frank ran me to talk about branding the Institute and I guess sort of my last 10 years or so, I was on holiday in Copenhagen. So I think what you may have here is a whole lot of holiday snaps instead of a presentation. But you know what? Like all landscape architects on holiday, taking photos of cycleways and texting them back to the team and saying, oh, what about this idea for that project? I was thinking about, what are we needing to talk about here? What is the last 10 years? What is the last 50 years? And I think a lot of that comes to a lot of the work that we do every day, which is about values. We are a very values-based organisation. All of us have our own values. And that is what I really want to talk to you about today. But then, of course, I got home and I was adding up the bills, and yes, this was the cost of my holiday. I did have an awesome time. We drank quite a lot of beer. We did some great things. And I put this number down because what I also realised is that this is the cost of my membership to this organisation over the period of my career. And that doesn't include paying for the conferences, it doesn't include the sponsorship that I do, the flying to things, the involvement in things. So I have a choice. I can go on an awesome holiday around the world, or I can spend this sort of money and be part of it. So my question was, so why do I choose it? Why do I choose to be a part of this organisation? Why do you all choose the same thing? The other thing that I was thinking about while I was away was Wellington. And it was an interesting thing, because here's a group of people that decided to change something. Now, we may not agree with the way they did it, but the whole country stopped at this moment for this event, and it was on national news, and everybody talked about it, and everybody wondered what they were talking about and why they were talking about it. Interestingly, there were about 1,000 people there. Well, that's interesting because that's about the number of our profession. So I want to bring all of that together, and I'm going to talk about this awesome subject, corporatisation and branding. Now, before you have that reaction, I want to talk a little bit about corporatisation, what it means, and I want to bring it back to values. So for somebody who makes aeroplane engines, their values are reliability. It's really obvious. You know, they do everything they possibly can to make sure that their values are really well known and that people can rely on them. And I bet you never thought that I was going to compare the Institute to a bunch of chocolate. But this brand here, again, absolutely trades on what it values. And we all know it. And we make decisions based on this brand and what it stands for. And we all know what that stands for. Many of the same things that we stand for: quality, local, you know, well-produced, sustainability. You know, these are sort of things that this brand really tries really hard to do. And when I started on the exec and I started working in branches, this was our brand. And we weren't actually allowed to use logos when I started. The logos were held centrally. And you had to apply to the president if you wanted to use the logo. Thankfully, we could steal them off the internet. That was possible. And if they didn't fit, what you could do is you could squash them up a little bit to get them on the page. And you could choose whatever font you liked, and you could make whatever you needed to say. And of course, the big thing is, you know, we had this NZILA creature. I mean, nobody knows what this NZILA creature really is. So what we started setting about was saying, actually, we need to pull all of this together. We need to professionalise ourselves. We need to create something that we're all proud of. And so a big part of that was taking the logo. And Frank talked a little about that this morning. Key to our heritage, but just explain who we are. Just adding the simple words of who we are. And then setting some rules around that about how you can use it, or actually, in this case, how you can't use it. And a big part of that was actually saying, we now trust you as members of this organisation, or as the public, to use our logo. Here, download it, take it away. If you're promoting the values that we stand for, we're there, and you can use us. That expanded to, you know, you heard from Sarah about the magazine. We needed to have a look at our website, and our website needed to also reflect those values about who we are and what we are. It took a couple of goes. We had a good go first, and we realised it was really terrible, so we had another go. But the idea of this website has always been the same. You don't need to read anything on that website. You can go there and you can see what we are about. Not just through seeing some awesome projects, but actually by seeing what those projects actually are and what's underneath them. So that was a really big, important thing for this website, and will continue to be going forward. And then starting to broaden that right across everything. You know, bringing in a really consistent, clear message of who we are. And it was amazing arriving at this hotel yesterday and just coming in through the Cordis and looking at this great big sort of branding right across the front and going, oh my God, look at this organisation. You know, we're a really professional, amazing place. I was really stunned by it. And then, of course, this was mentioned earlier, the idea of starting to get into social media. The magazines had died away. Nobody reads, you know, Stephen found this out, nobody reads magazines very much anymore. I mean, I still actually really like buying magazines. But people talk through social media. And social media is now much bigger than we are. I think Vicky was keen to tell me that, you know, we have 1,800, 2,000 people on Instagram at the moment. People coming up to me this morning congratulating me, not because they were here last night, but because they'd already seen it on social media. That's how we're starting to communicate what we stand for and how we get out here. And all of that's coming together. You know, even this conference, as I've mentioned, the awards programs, the various talks, the webinars and those sorts of things are all things that are starting to happen that say, this is what we're about, this is what we stand for, and this is us coming together. And then, of course, there was the replacement of the magazine, which has been talked about, the Landscape Architecture I threw out. Not strictly in our brand, and I can tell you there was quite a lot of debate about that, whether it should have been NZILA or not. I've come on board with this way of thinking that actually this is something supported by the Institute. It's supporting discussion of individuals. So we're there in the background as an organisation, but this is really a place for anybody, whether you're a member or not a member, to just talk about the things that we value. Now, I'm not going to take credit for all of this, or hardly any of it, because actually the key thing is what's happened behind the scenes. This is a photo that is incredibly difficult to get, because you don't see these people. But this is the team of people that are now paid behind the scenes to make the Institute work. And they are the ones that put these conferences together, they put the webinars together. They're the ones that take my 25 grand and put it into the right places and get the outcomes that we need. You know, and Vicky has been a really big part of changing this whole brand and professionalising our whole organisation. And what that's allowing us to do, and you will have heard about this, is starting to think about governance. And that's a big, horrible, terrible, scary word. But what the change really is that you've heard a lot from these people talking about all of the grafting that they had to do just to keep the Institute running. Well, we've now got a paid team who are running it on a day-to-day basis. That's awesome. We don't need to worry so much about that. Well, that frees a whole lot of minds up to just start thinking forward, to be much more strategic in the way that we're operating, to start forming sort of that board level, that professional high-level corporatisation sort of model of, well, actually, what are the things that we should be involved in and how can we go and do that? And the way that that's delivered is through working groups. And that's what I am imagining is going to start to be seeing a lot more of. You know, you've seen them for conferences, you've seen them for the awards. We're starting to put lots and lots of working groups together. And that's a great thing. We can have lots and lots of them. Special interest groups, people you say, look, I really, really want to help with this part of the profession. It means a lot to me. Brilliant, go away and work something out and be active. And then we have a governance board over the top who's managing all of that. So that's a lot of the change that's been happening in the last wee while. And one of the things, of course, I want to talk about is I think this has been a big game changer. And probably a lot of people in this room are still not entirely understanding of just how important this is. Because this is it. This is our brand, this is our values, this is everything that we stand for. And if you are into landscape planning, you will have read this. If you're into landscape design, you need to read this. If you're a student, you need to read this. You know, I've showed people this document, and when you look through it, not only do you see an incredibly professionally put together document that we could have only dreamed of 10 years ago. This is a book about New Zealand, and the photographs in it, the projects, are all of our pieces of work. And I think it's a really important place for us to sort of leverage off this sort of document into that governance model and start talking at very high levels within government, because we actually now have something that can say, look, we do know what we're talking about, we are professional, and we have shared values. And the key thing of that is, that's all of us. So we all have that responsibility. We all pay our $25,000 over our career to be part of that. And so it's up to all of us. It's not up to one or two in the exec or in the governance or someone behind the scenes to make these things happen. We all have that responsibility. And because as William has shown us, it only takes one person to start singing a song and we all join.
Tina, Ralph, Craig, Shannon, great. Well, Shannon's given us a bit of a warm-up for the next part of the morning, the final part of the morning, which is a question and answer session and a discussion session. We've got about 30 minutes or so. What I would like to do is to ask the panel, first of all, for a quick fire response to a question, while you guys are sorting out, thinking which questions you want to ask. And so we're going to do a quick fire, and whoever wants to answer or respond will go for that, and then we'll open the floor, and then what we'll be asking you to do is to put your hand up and ask your question. So if you just phrase your question out. The question that I've got that I'd like to challenge our panel with, and you can stand and wave your arms about when you answer, is what of all the actions we've heard about this morning, and then we've had an incredibly rich history of the profession, which action or event, which type of action or event has made the most difference to the people and landscapes of New Zealand, of Aotearoa New Zealand? Anybody got a response?
Well,
Frank?
there's a lot, Simon, but if you had to sum it up, I would say that the fact that we actually started, we succeeded, and I'd like to think the things that Shannon has discussed, I think that's for you people in the audience, the younger ones, to really grab and take forward. I mean, we did what we could with the resources we had, and I'm very proud of that. And it had to start somewhere, and I think we've been successful, and let's just go for it. Or you go for it.
Yeah, and I would just take that further and say I think the fact that we started, but I think it's the fact that we just exist. That is something that I think I just talked about. We are a really large group of people. We have the ability, through documents like that, through our branding, and just through us, to go and pitch a tent on Wellington in our way and make some difference.
And I'd go backwards instead and say I think it was Charlie Challenger that created that event, that made it possible, both Charlie and George Malcolm together, because one was the academic, one was the more practical. I think their combined initiative opened a door, and it's up to us to make sure that we see that there's a vision there and keep going.
I think that Di's comment about Charlie and George is really important, that those values, that valuing the landscape, that love for the landscape is what we share and what we have brought through the last 50 years and what will carry us through the next 50 years. We need to maintain that value.
I also think there's a slow embedding of the sense of landscape in the minds of allied professionals and decision makers across the country. It's been very slow. Most people still think we work with a wheelbarrow and a spade, but I think we're getting there in terms of the people who I work with.
Yeah, great. Stephen?
I think the profession's contribution to the gestation and emergence of the RMA was really quite significant. It became the sort of real launch pad for landscape as a topic, as a matter of national importance. And it's led to some really critical decisions like King Salmon and so on, which have tended to enshrine the importance of landscape as a key component of this country.
So, there's a question for you to be thinking about over lunch when we get there. Meantime, we have a great opportunity for questions or comments from the floor, please. What we'd like you to do, if you want to ask a question, please, could you raise your hand? We've always practiced that, so we know we can do that. There are mics in the two aisles, so if you'd like to raise your hand, and I'll try and move the questions around. I can see them all already coming up. Please just introduce yourself very briefly and ask your question and try and keep it as concise. Speak into the mic, please. And then we'll just see where it goes. If you have a general question for the panel, just say for the panel, or if there's something you particularly want to ask someone, well, just by name. So, where are we going? I see it first cab off the rank at the back there.
Kia ora, from Lincoln University. First, I want to thank you all for your great talks, for all the panel members. Thank you, Simon. It's really great to see the growth of work that the Institute has been doing over the past 50 years. And my question is a general one for the whole panel. For you guys, what has been the influence of international links and visitors on the NZILA?
So the question was, what has been the particular influence of the international links and visitors we've had upon our institute, our profession? Any particular highlights you want to highlight, you want to focus on? Frank?
I think it's been quite significant. We're isolated as it is. We were reliant on publications and what was happening, people travelling and coming back. But we were always conscious we needed to gauge where we stood, and we were open to bringing people in, and we felt that they were better advocates in some ways than we were, because we were Johnny on the block and we needed that expertise to come in. And we had some very good, successful speakers, and well, speakers, when I say they spoke at a conference, but we invariably toured them around the country, and we got sponsorship to do that. That stayed for 2 weeks. And they were great advocates because they'd been there, done that, and suddenly people took notice. So you can't underestimate the value, and I think they got value too that they took back, because as Stephen pointed out, we started to do our own things and question things too. And I think some of them we did it better. So, we're not isolated, we can do it.
Anyone else? Stephen?
Well, I couldn't isolate it to people coming here. I've been to 2 of the conferences held in Ascona, which were fascinating because they were a sort of they became a sort of session for academic discussion of where landscape assessment, planning, and to some extent design was going. And I just found them absolutely amazing. But what I also discovered was that we were really progressing at a rate that we were breaking out of the bonds of relying on models from Europe and the US. And we were developing our own models, which have moved beyond, in many cases, where the Europe and US was, and that was by 2006. So I think that engagement has always been there, because initially we were so reliant upon, well, how do we do this? Where do we get the information? Where do we get the principles and ideas about how to undertake landscape assessments? Even what has influenced a lot of our design thinking, a lot of that has come from other parts of the Western world. But then we started to develop confidence in our own approaches, and that's become very marked since around the early 2000s.
I think that's a very fair comment. I mean, there's been a huge turnaround. I would put a personal comment in here. I first came to Aotearoa, to Te Waipounamu, almost exactly 40 years ago. And at the time knew nothing about what I was coming to, and found a profession that even in the early 80s was undertaking an incredibly diverse range of practice for a relatively small number of people. And at no point did I ever feel the sense of this is a profession that needs to look overseas for its guidance. And in fact that shift is accelerated. I mean, in many ways we're having to strike our own pathway, and that's very much the way we should be going.
Just to add to that, yes, we've gained a huge amount from people like yourself, Simon, who have been trained in other countries and have brought different perceptions here, because were it not for that, we might become rather inward looking. So we've had Nada We've gained from people who have come into our country and have joined us. And I think that's really important to help us to look outward as well. But there's still some things that we could learn. There's some landscape courses that teach mediation, for instance. There's some that teach cultural landscapes, such as Val Kirby, who came to Lincoln, who we gained from as well, who had much more expertise in that area. So I think we'll continue learning if we continue doing that, to learn what is overseas, but also remember our own values too.
So it's very much that two-way exchange. And so in that spirit, thank you for the question. Next question, please. Here we go.
Sure. Thank you. I love that we've got Te Tangata Manu out as a guide for assessment. However, I'm on a national body as a landscape architecture rep for fire resilience. And whilst climate change has been mentioned a number of times, I hear all this criticism comes to me because I'm the one landscape architect on this panel, that the profession isn't addressing fire resilience and spatial and materiality and all these things. And I wonder if I would be interested in the panel's response, should we be moving towards a process, a policy, a method to ensure professional landscape architects are actually addressing climate change, including fire resilience.
Thank you, Dave. The question, to put it in a general sense, is, are we really doing enough to prepare ourselves for the challenges of climate change?
No. It's here. Sorry, Simon. Look, I had a personal experience of this. I was doing work in the Waitaki Basin, and I was staying in a B&B, and one evening they said to me, "Oh, have you seen the fires down at Glentana, near Glentana Station, and so on down towards Mount Cook?" And I said, "Yes," but I said, you need to think about your own situation here, because the entryway to this B&B is through a copse of pines, and this whole village, which just happened to be Lake Ohau, is also completely enclosed in pines, and you've got wilding pines spread right throughout the Mackenzie Basin. Well, I left the following morning and drove to Christchurch to catch a flight back, and that night most of the village burned down. So,
Could we just ask you to step to one side, sir? We'll have a few questions.
We're in this crazy world where we have this billion trees program, which was originally supposed to promote 75% native planting, and now 75% pine planting, including 5 more conversions that were approved by the Overseas Investment Commission last week. And we're just producing this monoculture that is literally a time bomb. I mean, if anyone looks at pines, they're just absolutely full of resin. They're full of terps, in reality. And so they are literally a time bomb for this country in terms of climate change. And is anybody doing anything about it? Are we doing anything about it? Absolutely not.
Well, does anybody else want?
I think what you're starting to talk about is the area that I think that we need to be heading, and it's not just about fire, but actually it's about being proactive in the world. And I think, my reflections putting my presentation together was, I think for the last 10 or so years, we've been very focused on running ourselves, and we've been quite good at running ourselves, but we haven't really been that active out in the world. I think we are now at this milestone, an opportunity And that was what I was talking about with the governance and being able to say, well, we've got that covered now, we can run ourselves, we don't need that. We can start having these discussions. And that's what I really hope to see that whole governance discussion go. That if we decide that, yeah, look, actually climate change is an area that we need, well, maybe we need, and Rachel, Gavin, close your ears, you know, maybe we need another Te Tangi Atu Manu, which is on fire, you know, or maybe we need another one on this or another one on that. Well, that's what I think we absolutely should be doing, and we should be taking the lead on that, and we've got a platform now, I think, to be able to do that.
What I'm hearing is the passion that we were hearing about from Frank and our other more senior members that started the profession in its first place. Passion for action. Questions? Next question, please. There must be. Yes, in the middle here at the back. Thank you.
Kirsty from Stantec in Christchurch, and I just wanted to ask a question of Sarah and Julia and Di about what it was like back in the early days being a woman in the profession.
So the question, Kirsty, was directed at our wahine and saying, well, what was it like back in the day? Not you, Frank.
In actual fact, I think that it was more about being a landscape architect in the day. We were fighting to be recognised for what we did as landscape architects, and whether you were male or female wasn't of such an issue in the landscape architecture profession.
I think we were incredibly lucky that landscape architecture was egalitarian. You know, there were sort of equal numbers of males and females, and it never seemed to be a particular issue, though Charlie was often quite terrified of females. But and it was interesting because that was all in the environment of Lincoln College, where you had what we call the meat choppers. You know, the boys came off the farm for 6 weeks to do a meat course, or there was a one-year demand to get someone off the farm. And so it was a really interesting context, but within the course that we were doing, the people we dealt with, our lecturers, our fellow students, it was never an issue really.
And just supporting that, I found occasionally I was used, and it might sound weird because of my sex. In other words, I was sent out to sort out the management of some of the landscapes in Wellington City because it was thought that the groundsmen and the managers may not say the same things to me as they might to somebody else. So I deliberately used strategically, and it actually worked most of the time. Overseas, I found the situation totally different in that, as I used that photograph, but that wasn't an unusual situation at all. And in some countries it was most pronounced, and also Europe as well, in that there was a very formal, structured situation, not in New Zealand. So I think we've been very lucky. What do you call it? The gender balance in universities has been pretty much there, and comparing that with work that was done on women in architecture and the work I saw before that, we haven't had the same sort of issues. So I think we're fortunate as women in that, but obviously times change, and we have to keep on making sure that we work together and that there is that balance.
And just to reinforce that, I think from memory, certainly since the undergraduate degrees were introduced, the gender balance in the degrees has been pretty good. In fact, sometimes it's gone particularly towards female. I mean, it's certainly not a male-dominated discipline in the universities. That was great. Thank you. Next question. Oh.
I was just going to ask.
Hang up.
I stand up. I don't say anything important. I was just going to suggest as a young woman working in the emerging field of landscape architecture. It wasn't always straightforward.
So for those of you who didn't catch that, it was turned around. So Di, having asked a previous question, what was your experience? You were a very early graduate.
Exactly 50 years ago, maybe a month away, yeah. I got employed by Lands and Survey Department and based in Tuia, and I was based in the Ministry of Works offices as a landscape assistant. There was Ray Wright was there as a landscape officer probably, but I was there as a landscape assistant. And I got to go and was involved in the Tonawera Power Scheme and giving advice, and there was headlined in the Tuia Chronicle, female student and 1,100 men. Dreadful sexist article. And I stormed into the admin office, Ministry of Works, and they just thought it was all hilarious. But it was very sexist. And then I worked for Ministry of Works in Dunedin once I graduated, and once George Malcolm let me go down there. And I was the only woman allowed to go to site visits. There were soil and water conservation officers, qualified, not allowed. Planners, women, not allowed. But luckily, there was no blokes that were landscape architects in ministries or in government in Dunedin. And so I was allowed to do field work, but I had a whole team of PEP workers, or maybe it was precursor to that, who walked off the job. We don't work for a woman. And then being told by the public service that there was no rules about that, and having to come back. But I did feel that I might get thrown over a cliff on the old site.
Fortunately for us, though, you weren't. Thank you for that, and thanks for the prompt, Jan. Any questions from this side of the room? Yes, down here, please.
Hi, I'm Rita from Studio Sip. I just had a question about the increasing role of landscape architects within master planning, urban design, built environment, and as an institute, are we doing? Should we be more involved within the development of built environments, including the protection, restoration, and management of our non-developed landscapes? And just wanted to get the gauge on, do you think we are doing well or doing better, and what is our role going forward in that space?
Thank you. That's a very timely turn towards the urban, and asking, what has been the relationship between the institute and urban design, and what should it be in the future?
Yes. No, there's absolutely no question about that. I think we've actually lost ground as a profession. I think a lot of councils see urban designers as dealing with all urban matters, and landscape architects sort of deal with the stuff outside. And that's very unfortunate. And I just had an experience of being involved in a hearing which largely revolved around the degree of public benefit, public open space, spatial development in general, offsetting residential development, and we managed to completely flip the recommendation from the reporting planners because we came out with a completely different perspective from the urban designers. And I think that landscape architects have got a very valid role to play. I put in a submission on the Natural and Built Environments Bill, whatever it was, position paper, something like that, which is hopelessly inept when it comes to to dealing with our future suburban and urban environments, despite the fact that that's what it's supposed to be focused on. And so we do need to be involved. We need to be engaged actively there.
Anyone else like to comment on that?
Well, I think landscape architects are getting involved in urban design, and there's quite a few in this room who I know focus on urban design. So I think it's happening. I think it'll grow, if anything.
And I think there's going to be certainly some interesting questions that will come up in the later sessions dealing with climate action about the nature of the urban design that we might be involved in. Shannon, you want to?
I mean, I also think you've got a good point. Just got to go back to master planning. I'm actually really thrilled that I am seeing more and more landscape architecture firms or lead firms or even landscape architects at the helm of projects. Certainly that's an area that we do work ourselves, and it's really lovely to be working collaboratively with engineers particularly, or with architects who aren't trying to be the boss. We're all in that level collaboratively. But yeah, I do think that as a profession we've got more to do in that regard. I think, as I said before, I think we should be focused on our values, and I don't want to take away from all of the work that's sort of done on accreditation and that sort of thing. But I actually wonder whether there is an opportunity for urban designers to start embracing our institute if they share the values that we share, because I think there are a lot that do, and that we could grow by having them on board. And I also I'm looking forward to seeing the awards tomorrow night, because I have been critical of the awards previously, where large master planning projects that have been led from an urban design haven't been awarded because they've sort of been seen to be doing the green fluff in the award program, and it's really hard putting in awards when actually it's the process that you're putting in, not the actual potentially some of the outcomes. And I think that's where we've got a lot of work to do in my view.
Well, thank you very much. Frank has asked me, when he tapped me on the shoulder and asked me to come and take this role, he asked me to also summarise the morning. So as we're running in towards Kai time, it's my role now just to try and wrap up the discussion. First of all, thank you, Frank, Di, Julia, Sarah, Stephen, Shannon. Thank you indeed for your overviews and insights, and to the audience for the questions. Yeah, we have heard a story of passionate commitment and the passion being reignited, and also hard work. I've actually taken three main themes from these interweaving stories. The first one was, in the process of building the profession, we heard a lot about the crucial role of the early champions and their advocacy. That is certainly a critical part of the profession, but it hasn't gone away. We're hearing that we've got new issues to advocate for. We need new champions. We have new champions, and so the role of champions in the profession is critical. I've also been struck by the comments on the crucial role of conferences, and here we have another one. The conferences as a catalyst for new directions and initiatives. And so despite the digital age, and obviously COVID has really driven us further down that rabbit hole of face-to-face on the screen, there's still a major role for face-to-face discussion. And a particular feature of the past 50 years that's come out from all the presentations, but particularly from Julia, from Frank, and from Sarah, and from Di, has been the role of collegiality. That the profession has been built around a strong sense of collaboration between committed individuals. And I guess one of the questions that occurs to me there is, why did that happen, and what will be the future? Well, one of the obvious reasons for it starting that way was because we had one educational program. And many of us remember friends we made at university or at college, and that shapes our lives. We now have 3 programs, and so we have increasingly diverse shared experiences. So we're also shifting, or talking about shifting, the nature of governance, and the type of involvement in the profession will change if we move towards a more corporate structure. So the question that raises for me is, what are the ways in which we can nurture the collegiality that has been such a powerful influence on our history so far? Well, that was one set of thoughts. The second set relates to the periods of adaptation, and we've heard a lot about the importance of the profession adapting to changes, adapting to external changes, particularly the New Zealand experiment. Jane Kelsey talked about the changes in the 1980s as the New Zealand experiment, and also the subsequent developments from that. We heard about the reforms of the public sector, all the operational functions being devolved, and the greater focus that led to on private practice, but also I think on local authorities. I think that was another consequence of that New Zealand experiment. We've heard about the RMA, and that has been hugely influential on our practice over the last 20, 25 years, and is now being reformed, changed. So that's another set of new challenges. Will the new statutes have the same impact upon our practice? We've been through a period of globalisation which has enabled the extensions and the visits and the movement and the international connections we've had. COVID has obviously changed the way we think about travel, and particularly climate change is going to change the way we think about travel. So we've got some interesting issues there about our relationships at a distance. We heard from Julia about the impact of educational expansion and the increasing need for continuing professional development, both of which have reinforced the need for more formal accreditation and registration systems, and the new cultural competencies arising from our engagement with mana whenua will further develop those challenges. You know, that whole new direction of an Aotearoa practice has a whole series of implications flowing from it in terms of registration and accreditation. We've also heard about the role of sponsorship partners in enabling these activities to take place, both the communication activities, the conferences, and the development of a more sophisticated media presence. So interesting to think about where that will be going in the future. Who will be the sponsors of the future for us? I can't help noticing that a lot of our sponsors have been manufacturers. And manufacturers are some of the group that are going to face some of the biggest challenges in terms of climate action. So there's some interesting issues coming up there. And new technologies have been woven all the way through it. It's like Frank, I remember trying to clean up my many mistakes off the tracing paper with a razor blade, you know. Oh, hole. Start again. What new technologies will we find in the next few years to take us further? The third theme that I would just finish on then is our response that has been developing in the last decade, particularly, to some of the new opportunities. Diane has emphasised the accelerating engagement with treaty issues, and how important it is now working with Ngāho and with Te Tuanuku and developing our pathways towards an Aotearoa practice. And that's a momentum which is accelerating in the wider society, and one which we should be very proud to be part of. But it's going to be an interesting journey. It's a journey for us which will involve a lot of excitement and a lot of exhilaration and a lot of challenges. We have increasing public expectations for greater inclusion beyond gender and for greater equity. and for well-being in the landscapes that we design. And so there's a whole series of new requirements for our social practice, social license to practice, and that will continue. And finally, the overarching challenge in many ways, which has received less attention than it needed until recently. There are some notable exceptions, Craig, hopefully somewhere out here in the audience. The issue of climate change and the obligations of professional action in that area. And we'll be hearing more about that later in the conference. So our next 50 years will be exhilarating and at times perhaps daunting journey. And we will certainly need to sustain and grow the mutual support that has brought us to our 50th anniversary so successfully. So it's my pleasure to thank Frank Boffa, Diane Menzies, for your valuable historical overview of the NZILA, and our panel, Julie Williams, Sarah Collins, Stephen Brown, and Shannon Bray for their stimulating insights, and our wonderful audience for your engagement. So thank you very much indeed.